Well, thank you for coming and welcome to a talk about cross-functional communication. Seth and I are going to be speaking mostly about working between experience design teams and engineering teams, but this is really going to be applicable for any kind of team that you might be on.
So real quick, over here is Amanda. She leads our experience design team. She has a liberal arts education. She's been at HS2 almost 3 years now. She's a Xennial. Her disc profile is a C and a D, and her alcohol profile is a whiskey.
And Seth Dobbs over here leads HS2's engineering team. His background is in computer science. He's been at HS2 for almost 15 years. He's a Gen Xer. His disc profile is an I, and his drink of choice is tequila. We have been working together since 2015, and we quickly found out that we worked really well together. Due to our respective practices, we found ourselves working on projects that had challenges or pitches, but we found out that we worked really well and were able to communicate really well. So we started looking at the factors that led to that success, and that's leading to what you're going to be seeing today. And even though we have very different lenses on the world, we're able to work together and to help shepherd teams to make really great stuff. One anecdote I'll leave you guys with before we roll into the rest of the presentation is that one of our colleagues once made an offhand comment that Seth and I never disagree. And Seth interjected, and he's like, "Oh, Amanda and I disagree all the time." And I looked at him and I was like, "We do?" And I think that that's a really great example of how we should think about how we communicate and using a spirit of inquiry instead of kind of a focus on advocacy.
So, as Amanda was saying, we have very different worldviews, but we have to be able to work together, right? Getting design and engineering working together is what really makes great experiences happen. So having those different worldviews and priorities, one of the things we started trying to talk about is how do we teach the rest of our teams to work that way, right? How do we create a system where we can communicate effectively, not talk past each other, and really, work well together? And what are some of the obstacles and problems and things we should look out for to continue to kind of push our teams to work well together? So looking at the quick view of the contents for the day, we're going to go over some communication ground rules. Number one, we're going to talk about disconnect points. So key points in projects where it's really important to get communication right and where it's easy for it to go wrong and cause a lot of problems. We're going to talk about bad communication patterns, and then some constructive language and approaches to just speak about things differently, and then just wrap up with some key success factors and kind of tie it all together.
So in order for us to communicate well, we need to create an environment that fosters effective communication. I'm sure all of us have been in situations where it's been a little bit more on the toxic end of things, and even if you're trying really hard, that communication might always work. So we need to set some ground rules so that the expectation is that all of us will be receptive to different points of view, and that we have a few things that we always follow. The first of which is always assuming positive intent. So I might disagree, I might feel heated in the moment, I might have a strong disagreement with somebody and strong words, but ultimately I know that I have to be able to trust them. And I'm really lucky in that HS2 and other places that I've worked have had really great people. That's not always the case, but for the purposes of this, most humans are really trying to do the right thing and are trying to move things forward. So here's an example. If you first look at this, you might see a rabbit, or you might first look at this and you might see a duck. And neither of these two things are wrong. Now you can probably see both of them. And the reason that you saw one versus the other might be based on your experience. Maybe you'd seen this before. Maybe it was some other experience that you'd had in the past. But our prior experiences really influence the way that we perceive the world. And so if we apply that assumption to people, we can assume that other people are experiencing the world differently than we are. And if we assume that there are really few actually bad actors in the world, that really makes that next step of communication easier, because we're not judging whether or not you see a rabbit versus a duck. It's really just a differing point of view. So speaking of points of view, right now we're looking at a stereotypical engineer's view of the world. What you're seeing is complex, like even complicated. there are lots of critical details. If any of these specific decisions fall apart, well, it's going to have a significant impact on what would be worked towards as a perfect system. And it takes a lot of effort to stand all of this stuff up so that you can get that web application running. And also, next to that little blue box, you'll see a little user up there.
And that tiny guy I'll often talk about with architects, it's kind of a blind spot. I've worked with some of the clients that'll talk about, for minutes and minutes on end about the perfect system they've architected. And you ask them about that little person up there, and it's complete oversight. They haven't even thought about that person's impact on it. So it's pretty important that we understand that. In contrast, this is kind of the designer's view of the world, right? It's, these people are just out there living their best life using the apps that have been designed. I like this image. The phone is barely even visible. Like the technology is invisible, which is great, right? That's really a lot of the goal. But it's hard to do that, right? It's hard to build an experience that makes people that happy from a design perspective, and it's hard to execute it from a technology perspective. So we have different things, we have different constraints that we have to work with. But whether it's the rabbit or the duck, whether it's technology or a design, the end result is an experience that needs to be brought together by bringing those two capabilities together. So neither are wrong. It's a lot of hard work, and getting to this point takes a lot of work. It takes the stuff on the previous slide often to make it happen, but it takes focusing on this to make it happen as well. And you can't do that if you're not, if you're talking past each other, if you can't communicate well. So the second guiding principle here is that communication goes both ways. This is another key principle, right? Successful communication is the responsibility of the speaker. If people don't understand you, you own being understood. You also own understanding what other people are telling you. So it really goes both ways. If everyone is working that way, it makes it a lot better. Right, so part of it is communicating the right message, right? Communication should have an outcome, a goal. It's not just words, it's not sounds bouncing off of people's eardrums and stuff like that. Like there should be a message, a purpose, particularly when we're talking about work. Not just about hearing ourselves speak. But it's also the listener's jobs, right? We need to listen to understand, not to interrupt. I'm sure most of us have worked with or know personally people that as you speak to them, they're just kind of like nodding, not making eye contact, and just waiting for you to take a breath so they can jump in and say what they have to say. They're not listening to understand, they're listening to interrupt, and that's not a good, listening skill. So we really talk a lot about active or empathetic listening, where you're genuinely trying to understand and look for the opportunity to first really get what's being communicated to you before you try to transfer your ideas back.
And obviously, we're not the first people in the world to think that this is an important topic. Sheryl Sandberg has this quote, the ability to listen is as important as the ability to speak. Miscommunication is always a two-way street. And I think that's really important. So it's not just about the communication being a two-way street, it's taking responsibility for when there are miscommunications, what can you do to try and change it? So if we take that responsibility and we are active in our ways of communicating, that leads us to our next rule, which is that conflict isn't inherently bad. As we think about conflict, it may have a negative connotation, but it doesn't need to. Healthy conflict is part of a creative process, and there should be that push and pull. Having different ideas and building on them and pushing back is part of what we do. All of us here today are here because we make things for people and we want to be better at it. And if we want to make these great products and services, we need to be able to balance many different perspectives in order to make our decisions. The best types of products and services are made by balancing those points of view and really, pushing and pulling on the boundaries to try and expand the realm of possibility. By converging all of those possibilities, we can focus on the things that users want, that the business desires, and that also we can focus the technology not just on what's easiest or what currently exists, but things that solve human problems within the business domain, and not just on great experiences, but really the feasible delivery of those experiences in line with the business. So this tension is completely healthy and necessary. So this is what I would consider to be good conflict. So if we think about kind of a natural inclination as a subject matter expert, we have a tendency to view our own domain as the center point in which we see the world. It makes sense, right? Just like the rabbit or the duck, it's kind of where we're coming from. And sometimes that leads to behavior that indicates that you expect that the other two circles are the ones that need to adjust. So you can see that it's like pulling apart the point of view instead of converging in the center. So that's what we consider to be more communicating with a point of view via advocacy. That can really make it harder to find the best solution possible. But if we change the way that we're inquiring from that advocacy to inquiry, that's where we can really find a way to shift our position so that we're all leaning in and enabling all three circles to be effective. So this is where those great digital products and services or non-digital products and services can take place. So the way that we do that is by asking ourselves, what problem are we trying to solve? And usually that helps us quickly align on common goals and objectives, as well as the outcomes that we're looking for, not necessarily the specific steps along the way.
It's good, and this is important, right? Unresolved conflicts create real-world problems. If you don't address them, if you can't work through them, if you try to ignore them, if you don't recognize they're happening, a lot of just bad stuff gets created that sometimes needs to be reworked, sometimes just ends up with disastrous releases and things like that. So it's not just about making it harder to work together, it's about also just like the end result of your work together. The final product gets impacted on our ability to communicate well together. So we sometimes like to view systems interactions between a user and the system as like a dialogue, because it helps sort of surface sometimes what bad experiences are, and we sort of use this to start looking at where there's disconnects in this case. So in this first one, imagine you want to order a pizza for pickup, right? So you go online to place the order, and the first thing it does is ask you, where are you? So you give it a general, hey, I'm in Evanston, Illinois, that's great, I'm in Boston. And it says, well, I want your full address. And that doesn't make sense for carryout because it doesn't need to know that information, right? And so it's sort of a disconnect. I might be in a lift, I might not know where I am. I might have just checked into a hotel and I saw there was a pizza place across the street, and so that's what I want to get. So this creates, this is kind of a jarring system and something that doesn't really make sense from a user's perspective.
And if you extrapolate and think, why might this happen? Well, you can imagine that there may have been a team and they were having a conversation about the impacts of using some shared code. In this case, using code that was about delivery in the case of pickup. And it's funny because the irony of all of this is that if you were to pick up the phone and call, they wouldn't ask you any of this. Which is unfortunate because for the business, there's the impact of making this entire process less efficient. They don't want people to call. They want people to be going online.
So in the second scenario we have, imagine renting a car. And you're traveling, you want to rent a car, but in order to do so, you need to select a franchise, right? So imagine the rental car company works through franchises, and that's how they sort of manage their money. They manage the flow of fleet management and things like that. So in order to actually get a car, you have to first navigate through what franchise you want to rent from. Again, it might be easy to navigate back up and pick a different. It might be non-destructive, but a user wouldn't recognize that necessarily, and it's certainly not the mental model. If I'm going to Boston and wanted to rent a car, the last thing I would want to be asked or have to figure out is what franchise I want to rent from, because I don't know what that means. I don't know what the impact of that decision is.
And in this particular example, you could imagine a situation where the team was working with a database structure that already existed, one that was written for a tool that was used for the company itself to manage their franchisees. In this particular instance, if the data was already there that way, it would have been easier to continue to navigate the data, but under the assumption that you already know what franchise you want. So that's an example of where we're using the constraint of how we kind of see the world in our perspective and how that can impact other people's comprehension of what we do.
And then third example is searching for furniture. So imagine you wanted to buy some furniture for your office, for your house, and you have to choose between upholstery, occasionals, and case goods. Unless you actually work in the industry, you probably don't understand a thing that I just said and what that actually means for your decision. And it's confusing, right? We're introducing jargon that like furniture dealers and people in the industry understand and presenting them out to consumers, which is not really a helpful way of thinking about furniture.
And this is one of those situations I'm sure all of us have had experience with, where you're working with a customer or your internal company has jargon that doesn't make sense to the outside world. And sometimes you can work your way around this so that the interface itself doesn't have anything about case goods or occasionals. But if your data is organized in the same way, like the previous example, sometimes you can run into these mismatches.
All right, and so that brings us to the fourth rule, which is don't fall for the illusion of communication. Sometimes it seems like people are effectively communicating when they in reality are not. You think you're saying the same thing, but you're not, and it's not apparent. And that's a pretty dangerous place to be. I'm sure many of you have been in meetings where, you all walked away and maybe believed that you all actually got the same thing out of the meeting, but how often was that actually the case? Usually pretty seldom if you're not sort of actively making sure that. So we'll talk about a few examples. Oh, actually, what we'll first do is talk about a logical framework for this. So the one thing Amanda and I have in common is a love of quadrants for sort of explaining concepts. So we put one together to walk through sort of the different thoughts around if there's actually a disconnect and if you perceive there's a disconnect. Because it's pretty important to sort of look at both of these axes to figure out how to respond to it and even recognize the symptoms of a problem. So looking in the lower left initially, where there's actually a disconnect and you perceive there's a disconnect, it's actually a great place to be, right? You recognize, okay, we just don't understand each other. So that's good news, right? You can actually work through it because you recognize that there's a problem. And so that's great. It's certainly an environment of positive intent, as we talked about rule number 1. You can actually work through the disagreement via discussion and get to a point where you actually don't have a disconnect and you realize that you are truly in sync. In the upper left is when you perceive there's a disconnect, but there isn't one. So that's kind of an interesting place to be. And these conversations might start out with people approaching it like it is a disagreement, but you start hearing someone say, I think we might actually be saying the same thing. Sometimes people use that just to shut down an argument, so always be sort of sensitive to what that means, right? But work to it. And this is often an opportunity to find new vocabulary, to find new ways for your teams to talk about your work together. So again, there's positive things that can happen, the spirit of clarification. It's okay, I'm going to stop listening to interrupt you. I'm going to start listening to understand. Tell me everything you really mean. I'm going to tell you everything I really mean, and let's hash it out. So again, a good place. Like, okay, yeah, we really are in the same place. So now we're we've taken that time to really work through it and might have discovered that new vocabulary. The most subtle, the most damaging place is the illusion of communication. This is where we don't perceive that there's a disconnect, but there actually is one. Right, so when you have a problem that goes undetected, obviously that's a bad place to be, and it's harder to spot. And it can lead to things downstream that are a huge problem, like the engineering team saying to a designer, "Oh, we didn't estimate time to build that." Well, you're in the room nodding your head. "Oh, yeah, we didn't understand what you were asking," right? And so everyone might have agreed at the time, or appeared to, or even thought we understood the implications. I told you that was going to take more time. Well, no, you said it was going to be hard. You didn't say it was going to take more time and cost more. Those are different things, right? So these are all sort of aspects of the illusion of communication, and they lead to just unresolved ambiguity and a lot of downstream problem. We're going to dive deeper into detecting this in a little while and just all the different sort of warning signs that you hear and that you might say that indicate that you're not necessarily driving. So we'll get to that in a little bit more detail soon. Top right quadrant is a nice place to be. There's no disconnect and there's no perceived disconnect. This is kind of an ideal state, and it takes work, and it takes repeated work. Right? A highly functioning team is going to sort of spend a lot of time in this upper right quadrant where there isn't disconnects, right? And we all realize we are communicating, but it doesn't happen by accident or by magic, right? It takes work. It's not like a magical zone of no conflict, right? There might be conflict. We might, be having those deep discussions and then pushing ourselves back up into an agreement and understanding. So, even though you might get your team operating at this place 90% of the time, you stay there with a certain amount of cognitive vigilance of just being aware of whether or not you're actually losing track of each other. So, kind of repeating that, right? Good communication moves quickly to shift to an aligned team, right? We want to look at it as kind of a map of how we work our way out of these problems and get ourselves always back to highly functioning, right? So in that clarification zone, usually a quick conversation, discover new terms, okay, we're back to highly functioning. We're disconnecting and see that we're disconnecting. Let's have that discussion and push ourselves back up. And the illusion usually drives into a discussion because first we have to realize there's a conflict, and then we can work our way out of it.
So now we have ground rules for fostering an environment where communication can happen effectively. And we've identified a framework for thinking about miscommunications and the types of situations that might lead to them. But let's talk about some very specific areas in the course of a project where these disconnects are most likely to happen, and it's worth taking extra care to use that cognitive vigilance. So as an analogy, I'm going to use needing to get here from the airport this morning. And although I'll kind of caveat, working on a project is not just a linear path and can be very circuitous, and there's a lot of other complexity that I couldn't diagram here. We're going to use the map for today. But in this particular instance, the problem statement of needing to get here isn't actually enough to come up with the scope for the solution. If I were to say like, oh, I've got a path, like that would be premature. So let's talk about the scoping piece of it first. This is the first and biggest opportunity area to prevent problems and/or, I guess, risky area where problems can happen. It really goes back to creating a shared vision and a shared vocabulary so that you're on the same page. Seth and I, in the last couple of years, have really challenged our teams to always work together and create shared assumptions prior to jumping in and doing any kind of like true solutioning or estimation. The reason for that is because we've found problems in projects, and almost always it's because I had or not us in particular, typically not us, we don't do any work anymore, but people on our teams might have perfectly valid types of assumptions, but they're contradictory. So think about your assumptions prior to even jumping in to whatever it is that you're scoping. So let's say you've got a sense of how big the box is, and now the team is starting to work on it. Well, this is where chartering is really important. Going back to setting those ground rules, this is a place where you can start talking about roles and responsibilities. You can create alignment around expectations. So for example, if somebody on the design team wasn't creating appropriate markup to pass on to our front-end developers, like that would be a problem, and I would hope that we would have a conversation about that early on. Or if somebody has a suggestion from a previous project that didn't go as well, like that would be a time to bring it up. And it's also an opportunity to create a better shared vocabulary. So something I'm sure is near and dear to folks here is what's the definition of a template or a component or a module? And how many times have you been in conversations where you were talking with somebody and you thought you were on the same page, and then like weeks later you're like, oh crap. Well, this is the opportunity to try and prevent that. So next stop, requirement alignment and some joint problem solving. So at this point, you're getting into the nitty-gritty, but you have to plan like the actual course. And usually when you're talking about scoping, it's very high level. You're not going to get that details. But if you do start talking in the requirements gathering session about those assumptions and alignment, this is where you can make sure that you're triple checked that they are actually the same assumptions. Because those can manifest themselves in different ways depending on your perspective, going back to the duck and the rabbit. So in this particular instance, the conversation might be about not what route we want to take or what scenery we want to see, but instead it might be like what transportation technology do we want to use. Another point would be jumping ahead in a project. It could be a design review. So that is a great opportunity that within a design team or with our engineering team or even with clients, or internal stakeholders, this is an opportunity where we can find out whether or not the assumptions that we thought we had in common actually are. And it helps us really open our mind and explore the why behind some of these design decisions and explore the implications of making those decisions. An ideal state would be that we've actually uncovered areas where we had different perspectives. So by the time we get to a sprint review or some kind of show and tell, we won't have as many types of questions or conversations. But in many projects, you might get to a point where something looks or behaves a little bit differently than we expected because there's been a new requirement or the data doesn't look like we thought it was going to, or there's a better idea that came up during the development process. So that's great, and that showcases the gaps between what our assumptions were even previously, like at a point in time, and where we are now. And then design QA or UAT, this is another opportunity to make sure, hey, are we coming from the same perspective? This is going to be closer to the end of the journey and closer to a launch of a product. So hopefully there's only minor adjustments. But sometimes stakeholders and customers can throw a wrench in the works. And although we're speaking about this from like a design and engineering perspective, I'm sure you can find a way to map this to your favorite, analog experience here. And although we're talking mostly from an agency consultancy perspective, this applies to in-house teams or not-for-profit teams or fill-in-the-blank teams. You have a project that usually has some kind of a cadence to it, and you can apply this. And one of the caveats from earlier, solution definition and solution implementation are not the same thing as a linear train ride. We find that even though our projects are very varied and take very different paths, the same types of points of kind of watch out are the same across all of them. And the same types of challenges that we see are the same across all of them.
And then one thing I'm going to comment on this slide, we have pretty deliberate choice of vocabulary, and it's just a demonstration on how we like to communicate. We don't talk about design and build here. We don't like to because it makes it seem like it's siloed. People think about design as being the experience design work, as build as only being technical work. And we believe it's always cross-functional work, that teams need to be working together regardless of what sort of phase or whatever it is. So we're pretty specific about talking about solution definition, which has a design and an engineering component to it, and solution implementation, which has a design element and an engineering element in it. So just an example of finding vocabulary that helps bring clarity to the process rather than confusion. Makes it a lot easier for us to be able to talk about it internally. So then that gets us to talking about bad communication and constructive language. So there's an example of, right away of sort of some constructive language to make us think a little bit differently about how we do our work. A lot of what we're going to talk about here is looking to just stop miscommunication in progress, whether you're hearing it, whether you're doing it, just developing that spidey sense and sort of a lookout for warning signs that things might not be going as well as you would like them to. So here first are some miscommunication signals. These are things you might hear, you might even say, that create ambiguity and miscommunication. Something is good or bad. Something's really important. It's the wrong way to do things. They don't want to do this, they said this. Something was handed off, there's no time. I mentioned earlier that's hard. One of the things I try to coach the engineering team working with me is to not use that phrase, because when you hear that one in particular, it sounds like it's a question of being lazy or not, when the intention is actually like this is going to take more time and more money. So beware of those kind of things. Yep.
And the reasons that these should flag your spidey sense is because they're all individual opinions and not facts. You could say that the point of view is from an individual perspective and not one of the team. And they focus this from that advocacy approach instead of an approach of inquiry. The last thing that I'd leave you with these particular types of miscommunication signals is that all of them are not outcome focused. They're very task focused. So if you hear these things, perk your ear up and see what you can do. If we go back to our pizza example, let's say that the team, having run into this type of problem, has identified and acknowledged that it doesn't make sense to ask somebody for their address if they're going to come pick up a pizza. And they do have this shared code that they're going to be using. And the team says it's going to be hard. But what if somebody on the team said, instead of thinking why are they lazy, or why are they pushing back, or why aren't they going to do it, just to explore the specifics of how much longer and how much more effort, or what the risks might be, so that you can, weigh the pros and cons. So those were all examples of listening to others and trying to let your spidey sense identify issues. These are things that you can look at your own language and look inward to try and see those areas. These are anti-patterns that really stop discussion. They kind of break the rules of our environment that fosters communication. Some of these examples I'm sure you've heard. As I've said before, I'm super busy. I told them already, or the clients approved it. And a lot of times I see people, and I've even myself said some of these things because we're frustrated, because we're perceiving a breakdown in somebody else's communication.
And so, as Amanda said, these kind of words, these kind of phrases shut down inquiry, right? Which is the whole goal of good communication, is a spirit of positive inquiry. And they indicate, as Amanda said, impatience. Sometimes there's an implicit put down of other people. Lack of just taking any kind of ownership of the situation, ignoring outcomes again. And so, it's pretty important to not use these kind of phrases, right? If what you want to communicate is that you feel more important than other people, that you don't have time to talk, right? You've definitely communicated that with those phrases, but you probably haven't communicated the things that you actually need to, right? So, really think about this. And also, obviously, as you hear other people use these kind of phrases, try to work through it. We'll talk about a few patterns for doing that in a minute. And so in this example, we can look at the furniture case, and the design team might have been working with knowledgeable SMEs, but they had that inside-out view, right? And they think, oh yeah, of course it's case goods. Everybody knows what case goods are, right? Occasionals, yes. And so a design was built around that, and the client approved it. They might have even supplied some of the IA. Here's how this information should be laid out. This is the best way to think about it. We love it. And so as it was brought back in to start working through the next phase of design and transitioning to development, someone might have even raised a question about it, and they said, well, now the client approved it. And that's phrases that, shuts down communication and didn't allow the team to explore, okay, but, is there really a better way to do this? Are we thinking about this the right way? And so third, the illusion of communication. And these are phrases that indicate that perhaps communication was attempted, but we're not owning whether or not it succeeded. And I'm sure everyone in here has used at least one of these, including us up here. The classic, I told them that, or it was in an email. Always again, I sent them an email. It's in Confluence. It's up in the wiki. I gave them a link to the wires. They said that they could do it, right? None of this is communication. None of this is ownership. Sending them a diagram isn't enough, right? Whether it's an architectural diagram or wires, right? They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but sometimes you only want to communicate 10. And if you don't take ownership of how it's actually delivered, you're not communicating.
So to sum up what Seth was saying, these are illusions because it's not confirming understanding, it's just continuing on with your assumption, using your own worldview instead of taking somebody else's perspective and incorporating it into your own, and really putting the onus of that communication entirely on another person, which shows lack of initiative and ownership. So let's go back to our car rental example. We identified that the team was working with some data rigidity, and we could even say that the internal team had talked about that the user should be able to rent a car from anywhere in the city, regardless of the franchise. So let's say that the designer just assumed that the concept of franchise was entirely removed, but the engineer implemented the model the way that it did, technically fulfilling the requirement because of the way the data was organized. So this was an illusion of miscommunication, or illusion of communication that wasn't a miscommunication, because while the first two examples that we went through are where it was able to acknowledge that disconnect, this one, the team didn't realize that there was a problem until it was too late. So as we saw before, it is possible to intercept from some of these non-ideal quadrants and move you into a better quadrant to position the work that you're doing. So let's talk about some specific ways where you can flip the script and kind of redirect some of those spidey sense flags that you were hearing earlier.
So again, miscommunication signals, we'll start there. Some of the ways to work through that, I won't repeat them, thank you for hitting the slide, how you might respond to some of these things, right? So when you hear some of those miscommunication signals, some of the best things are just getting readback and giving readback. What I hear you saying is this, and rephrase it in a different way in your own understanding to confirm. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Probe for more detail. When you say something's best or something's, not good, can we use non-judgmental words? Why? What is the outcome of it that's not desirable? And what outcome do we want to desire? Quantify the impact, right? Don't just, give me sort of an absolute. How is it affecting things? What isn't going to happen or what is going to happen? And just use this as an opportunity to seek to understand. All
right, so our communication anti-patterns. This is about focusing inward and acknowledging the things that you can do to try and make communication more effective. So it's really about acknowledging those disconnects. Like, it sounds like we have a disconnect. and repositioning conflict so that it's not about people, and kind of putting yourselves on the same side of the table working on the same problem. Even acknowledging it, like, I think we're working from two different sets of assumptions. You can do readbacks, just saying, like, I hear you saying that it's going to be more complex than you thought. I hear you saying, or like it sounds like this is urgent. And really focusing more on the outcomes as opposed to the specific things that somebody might be saying regarding process. So if you think about the example about the IA from the client, you know, it would have been potentially the right thing to do to say, like, hey, let's do a timeout and talk about whether or not this is the right thing to do right now. So let's tie the thing that there may be a disconnect about and tie it to the outcome of a project. Like, will this project be more successful if we spend a day to make sure that we're all aligned before moving forward? And really, it's about reevaluating where you are based on the current situation, which may have been different than when you made that decision before.
And then finally, again, the illusion of communication. So again, talking about communication being the successful imparting of information, the illusion is obviously, you know, bad. And so what are some of the things that you can really think about, right? And these are more about questions you can ask yourself. Did your message get effectively transmitted to your audience? Not was it delivered, right, which is different than understood. Did you verify your message was understood? Did you use some of those readback techniques? You know, are you taking that ownership? Are you taking the steps to make sure you're successfully understood and you're successfully understanding other people? That, you know, the example with the rental car, you know, everyone not in the room, yeah, can we make sure that you can rent a car without having to know about the, you know, without being limited by franchise anywhere in the city? Oh yeah, absolutely, we can do that. We have to navigate through it, which we didn't verbalize, right? So there's an opportunity to talk about the approach and make sure it actually meets the needs, right? So is everyone really working to make sure we have a shared understanding and not, you know, I know we don't always like being in meetings, but when we collaborate, you have to talk together and you have to do it effectively. The more effectively you do it, the less meetings that you need, so you can actually kind of get through it if you ask those questions and get all that stuff done up front. All right, so kind of getting to the wrap up, key success factors and wrapping this up, right? We want to, you know, help create that right environment for good communication. We've talked a lot about, you know, the problems that disconnects can make, the different kinds of things that can happen, the different places where disconnects can occur, the negative outcomes of just not really owning that. So just, you know, offer a few closing thoughts. And, you know, first and foremost, you know, it's our philosophy at HST, it's our philosophy in general. We succeed or we fail as a team. Right, 100%. Most of our work is working with other people, and if you can't get along, if you can't have that at least communication and be clear about what you guys need to do together, you're going to fail. And in this case, it's really, really important in the work that we do to think of team as being multiple skills. Right, it's not just, well, the engineering team is working great together, design team works great together, but the two teams don't work together. Well, no, that's probably the most critical team at times, the one that's cross-functional. So it you know, it doesn't matter if you see the duck or the rabbit. If you're seeing that, you know, end vision of, you know, the people using the app or all the underlying gory detail that makes it work, all that stuff has to come together to succeed.
So it really comes back to creating that environment. It's the first step to making sure that you have the ability to foster good communication on a regular basis. And it really, those ground rules are very simple, like always assuming positive intent. That can be somewhat difficult to practice, but ultimately there are very few bad actors. Understanding that communication goes both ways, and so does miscommunication. Making sure that we're taking responsibility for not just transmitting a message, but the reception of that message. Understanding that conflict isn't inherently bad, and that there are going to be times where we disagree, and that's the reason that we're working with other people, so that we can hash through, you know, differing perspectives and ultimately come up with the most successful thing that we can. And lastly is kind of the big gotcha, don't fall for that illusion of communication, because that's where it bites you on the butt the most and is the most painful. So to wrap up, I know this is kind of a brick to head statement, but communication is really a learned skill that requires a lot of practice. This is really hard, it takes a lot of work, there's no silver bullet. And we hope that you can use some of the things that we've learned, sometimes the hard way, and apply them to your teams and your communications. So thank you so much for your time and coming today. Feel free to reach out to either of us, you know, here today or on LinkedIn or Twitter or any other social channels.
All right. Thanks, everybody.